They found the hut because the path bent toward it the way water bends around a stone, and because the wind off lacked a Derborence sounded different there, as if the boards had learned to hum. Andreas Keller's name would not be spoken aloud for another 48 hours, yet the room already felt shaped to fit him. The German couple who came upon the warped door were looking for a view of Les Diablerets reflected cleanly in the lake. Instead, they found a structure that did not appear on any of the tourist maps, a roof scabbed with lichen, a latch tamed long ago by rust, and the smell, mouse, damp paper, cold ash, of time not entirely asleep. Andreas Keller belonged to another summer. The photograph tucked in the field guide by the window proved as much. A young man with a 1970s fringe, sleeves pushed to the elbow, grinning at the camera with one eye near closed against the glare. The tourist saw only the back of the photograph at first, a white border stamped August 74, before the woman tilted the book and the face slid out of shadow. The man in the picture looked almost close enough to talk to. Then her partner, peering past the fallen crossbeam toward the corner where boards had pulled back from stone, said a word he would later deny. Bones. The skeleton lay half in, half out of soil, ribs like a collapsed basket, vertebrae aligned by patience rather than care. Between them, a shard of mandible, broken long before the hut learned to keep secrets, rested against the sternum. Beside the bones, a chipped enamel mug ringed brown as a T-moon, a paperback, Flora Alpina, Valet, swollen by damp, a braided leather bracelet darkened by the oil of a vanished wrist. They stepped backward together, an instinct older than rescue plans, and the door, in sympathy or fatigue, swung wider. The call to the Valet Cantonal police went through a repeater that made their voices sound calmer than their hands. They were told to keep the door open, to touch nothing, to write the time on anything that could be written upon. They sat on a stone, and the lake kept up its conversation with the wind. It was a short walk back to the trailhead, but a long wait forward to the first blue lights stuttering against dwarf pines. The officer who ducked under the lintel wore the expression of a man who had learned that rooms sometimes greet you with echoes. He did not say the word skeleton. He said scene, and the hut became a document. In 1974, the lake had been the same color, blue with a bruised undertone, but the men who came to it were different. Andreas Keller was 27 that August, an apprentice engineer in Bern who had fallen for plants with the intensity other men reserve for arguments. He brewed black tea with a bruised cardamom pod in the mornings and poured it into a chipped mug he preferred over newer ones because old enamel felt more honest in the hand. He wore a green canvas parka patched at the elbows with squares of darker cloth, and on his left wrist a narrow braided leather bracelet his sister Sabine had made while the two of them sat on the back steps of their mother's building and pretended the world could be improved by patience. In his rucksack he kept a thin notebook, a pencil sharpened to a point he admired and would never confess to biting, a loaf of bread and a wedge of Gruyere bound with string, a waxed packet of postcards he intended to write and never did, and a small photograph of his mother standing under the tram wires in Woburn with her hand lifted, as if hailing luck. He had come down to Chaon with two friends to walk the circuit to Pas de Cheville, to eat late at the Café du Lac, to name gentians in the margins of the Flora Guide, as if speaking a plant's name were a type of shelter. They set out under weather that wore its doubt lightly, a thin scarf of cloud, a sun that had mislaid its temper, wind that declined to choose a direction. An innkeeper with a face like a well-used map told them that the Bice had not been cooperative yesterday, that hail in the next valley had made cows lower their heads in unison, and that the hut by the second bend, the one Andreas had asked about, was friendly only to those who remember how to wait. He said it without malice. Andreas smiled in the way of people who pretend to understand warnings and then rely on luck to complete the translation. At 11 they ate bread on a flat rock while the lake rehearsed a sheen. Andreas poured water into his mug because he said lakes tasted different from streams and ought to be learned separately. He wrote in small letters, larches pallid green, water a finger lower than July, one gull, noisy, bracelet tight, fix later. At the fork where the path rose toward the pass and a lesser track ran left along the shore, he said he would look in on the hut from the postcard, 2 bends, a bit up the bank, hardly any distance, and meet them at La Luzerne stream. He left with his parka open, his book under his arm, his rucksack lighter by bread and heavier by intention. He was not reckless. He counted his steps without counting in front of anyone. When the cloud turned iron and the first hailstones rebounded from the path like urgent punctuation, the friends waded through one song's length of weather and then two. At La Luzerne, they heard only water insisting upon its own idea. One friend went backward with an optimism thin as the air and called Andreas' name into the Alpine grammar that flattens all syllables into a single, respectable vowel. No answer came but the sound of sheep turning their backs and the clipped consonants of rain against rock. They ran for the car park when the second volley of hail taught their knuckles humility. For they were dripping on the tiled floor of Shaun's police desk, telling a man with neat handwriting about a green parka, a leather bracelet, a mug that believed itself essential, a hut that did not know them yet. Air glaciers flew because that is what it does when the valley uses the word storm, as if hoping flattery will make the thing feel welcome and leave. A rescuer with a rope around his waist leaned out into a weather nothing owed him and tried to find green against green, canvas against dwarf pine, the light catch of enamel against afternoon. On the ground, men from the Alpine Club formed lines that looked ridiculous only to people who have never found a thing while not looking for it. They banged on hut doors with knuckles that learned diplomacy in other years and shouted, "Police!" into rooms where the last authority had been a stove. The logs read like a poem afraid of adjectives. 1710, search suspended. Hail, regroup Café du Lac. 640, resumed. Team C East Shore. Team A hut cluster. Dog delayed, handler sick. 822, air glaciers negative. Cloud 1900 m. Turbulence moderate. 1012, hut above second bend door locked no response no signs. 1230, leaflet from Flora book near path. Pencil blurred by damp. They found a thermos cap the color of the inside of a coin. They found a twist of string stained with cheese. They found no Andreas. After 3 days the mountains asked to be left alone. The police put his file into a drawer labeled missing, then into a box labeled unrecovered, which is a way of admitting that verbs sometimes refuse to conjugate further. His mother placed his photograph on the microwave because grief, like soup, seems to ask for reheating. His sister braided bracelets she did not mail. Detritus of time gathered in the hut while nobody watched. Larch needles crisping to dust under spring feet, a scatter of mouse pellets like punctuation, the slow, practical rod of timber that knows the weight of snow. The door learned the trick of swelling, of consenting to shut itself. A man could lie down to wait and never stand again, his tea cooling beside him, his book softening, his body beginning the slow conversation with wood that ends in agreement. Lakes alter their mind every hour but keep their secrets for longer. The map at the cafe kept the red search grids pinned to cork as if lines on tracing paper could hold off forgetting. The innkeeper polished glasses and left one small square unpolished where Andreas' name sat in upside-down newsprint. People grew older around the absence, and the absence behaved with good manners. It is a particular cruelty when a room is asked to remember what men decide to forget. The hut did not misbehave. It kept its rain, its sills, its mouse trails. It's quiet. When the German couple pushed the door, the hinge surrendered with a civility born of practice. The light slid over the boards like a thing remembering an acquaintance and fell into the corner where soil had accepted ribs, where vertebrae aligned themselves the way books do when no hand has moved them in years, where the skull lay with its jaw unfinished, and, near it, the shard of mandible that completed no sentence. On the radius lay the flattened darkness of leather that had been a bracelet, the braid still braided, the knot still a knot. The enamel mug ringed itself with a brown moon. The book considered Bloom and decided against it for the moment. The photograph waited with its face down, the white back stamped a UG74 with a convenience bordering on unkindness. The forensic technician from Shaun brought light enough to insult the room. He set a scale card beside the mandible shard and took a photograph, then another when a fly colonized the number 10. He breathed gently on the pages of the Flora Guide to unstick them and found Andreas' small, disciplined letters listing plants. Gentiana ecalis abundant. Leontopodium absent. Humidity under larch. Vice contrary. In one margin, bracelet tight. Fix later. The leather now did not tighten for anyone. The bones went in trays padded with foam that had cushioned hundreds of other truths. They lifted the door off its hinges because the door could not be trusted to choose honesty each time. They labeled the mug, the book, the bracelet, the photograph with numbers that would later be fed to a computer that believes numbers can do anything. At the hospital in Shaun, Dr. Mireille Zumbach, whose voice often startled new interns by being kind when facts were not, looked at the bones the way a librarian looks at a first edition, not with reverence, but with a competence that protects reverence from sentimentality. Male, she said without dramatics, 25 to 35, robusticity moderate, stature estimated around 178 centimeters. The mandible had been broken once at the left parasymphysis and had healed, the bone remodeled with the calm eagerness of youth. The lower first molar had a small composite filling. The skull sutures were not yet the knots they would one day become if a man lived. Rodent gnaw marks on several ribs told of a season when the hut's small citizens were hungrier than respectful. The words paramotum and trauma did not find a place in her report. Undetermined shouldered most of the weight, as it so often must. An archivist in a room above the police garage climbed a ladder to a shelf that greeted him with dust and the smell of old paper mobilized. He found the box. Missing persons, 1974 to 77. Shaun/Valet, and inside a file with Keller, Andreas typed neatly enough to make the throat hurt. Photocopies of letters, a map with coffee rings and pencil crosses, an Air Glacier's flight sheet with the pilot's tidy negative, written more times than seemed fair, and a letter from Madame Keller in hand that attempted uprightness. I ask only that you do not forget my son as easily as you wish the weather to change. The reopened file placed her letter on top, because the present owes the past concessions when it can afford them. Dental records are not designed to outlive clinics. The Grafen practice in Bern had merged with a modern outfit that preferred screens to files and forgot to love cardboard. An assistant who understood that paper sometimes wins went into the back and pushed aside 2 crates of outdated brochures. She found a folder with a blue elastic tired enough to resemble pity. Inside, a chart. Number 36 composite, 1973. Number 31 observed crack, healed. Notation in the same blue ink as the year Andreas bought a better pencil. An email with scans left burned for Shaun with a note the assistant should not have attached and did anyway. If this is him, tell his mother I still remember her perfume, civet and orange. His mother had been dead 20 years. Truth does not check. Dr. Zumbach matched chart to radiograph and radiograph to bone, the neat geometry of dental roots aligning like a reconcilement. Concordance at number 36, healed crack at number 31, mandible remodel that fit the story of a youthful mistake never told. She wrote identification, strong, pending DNA, and let her shoulders drop half a centimeter. DNA is a faith that requires technicians in white coats to be priests of patience. From the petrous bone, she charmed out enough ancient code to do more than guess. From a molar that had survived mice and humidity, she asked for more. A sister existed, whispered the file, Sabine, last known in Basel in the 90s. The policewoman who had ducked the hut's lintel found her in Montpellier after 3 phone calls that sounded like archaeology and 1 that sounded like apology. Sabine did not wait for sentences to finish. She offered her cheek, her name, the small twist of her mouth when the swab scraped the inside of it. Weeks later, a subject line in the lab's email read concordant, maternal line, autosomal supportive. The Valley's air rearranged itself around that word. They told her in person because that is a debt bureaucracy remembers to pay when it can. Sabine came to Shaun with a shoebox of photographs. Andreas at 7 with a slingshot he could not aim. At 13 with a scabbed lip from a bicycle and the same jaw later broken and well mended. At 24 in a kitchen, flour on his sweater, a loaf arranged like an argument on a wooden board. She brought a bracelet, the twin of the one in the evidence pouch, and held them both until the leather warmed and time admitted a small defeat. She asked to see the mug and the book. She held the mug as if it were hot already, and it understood. The newspapers printed versions with different vocabularies. A Geneva daily wrote, spare and write, Derborence rent son nom. A Zurich tabloid, allergic to honesty, declared, skeleton in lakeside hut solves mystery. The Valais local used a photograph of the lake, where Blue tried to be innocent and failed. The Café du Lac slid both papers under glass, where coffee rings could bless them without damage. Hikers pointed across the water at the hut and asked questions in softer voices than they used for weather. A policeman returned to the innkeeper who had sold bread to 3 young men in 1974 and asked him to repeat things he had already repeated to himself in the privacy of tired mornings. He came in for directions, the innkeeper said. Polite. Asked if the hut was still friendly. I told him huts are as friendly as the people in them. I regret saying it only once. A retired Air Glacier's pilot said the cloud that day was a wall no man had the right to walk through. That if the door had been ajar, he would not have seen it for hail. A shepherd, a boy then and a grandfather now, said he had heard dogs bark that night far away, and his father had said wolves. But now he wondered if the dogs were talking to a man with bread in his pocket who had decided to become very quiet. Rumor, which never pays taxes, went to work. Somebody's cousin swore Andreas had met a stranger up by the second bend. Fists or knives, or nothing at all, then convenient silence. Dr. Zumbach's report, deprived of theater, offered no paramatum fractures, no knife traces on bone, no bullets, no broken hyoid, no evidence that violence had been done by anyone except weather and the arithmetic of exposure. Another version put choice in his pocket. He meant to vanish, had argued with professors, had lost the thread of his work, had followed the old romance of disappearance. The book left open on a page about Alpine Rose suggested otherwise. The mug dried in a ring. The postcards unwritten. The bracelet tight and noted as tight. Men who choose disappearance practice tidiness first. The mythic variant. The lake keeps one every generation. Returns him when it remembers how. Flourished as myths do when facts excuse themselves. Old men nodded at it, as one nods at a hymn once known by heart. The policewoman redrew the room on paper because drawings sometimes coax clarity from stubborn air. Table by the window, mug ring mark right of center, book near edge with photograph used as a bookmark. Bed frame against inner wall where boards met stone. Bones oriented head toward lake-facing side. Legs under planks that fell later. Door hinge failed long after deposition. Rodent nests composed of large needles and paper fibers torn from book edges. The picture held a man arriving out of hail, shutting the door because doors and men have habits, drinking lake water, reading a page, lying down to wait in a room colder than outside, and, when metabolism finally tired of argument, losing an argument no biography mentions at the end. The funeral in Bern did not pretend to be about answers. The coffin was light, bones and soil, and the bracelet lay within. Sabine placed the photograph from the Flora book on top, Andreas by the lake, the grin that made time consider mercy. The pastor read not the psalm about lifting eyes to hills, which felt too pointed, but the one about shelter, which made the old women nod and the young men swallow. People from Shaun the family did not know stood at the back. A policewoman who had learned the room in the hut by muscle memory now learned the names of those who came forward to speak, because names are a kind of recovery bureaucracy is bad at, and people must practice. Afterward, at a table that held more cake than necessity, Sabine said to the policewoman, "If you had asked me last year whether I wanted certainty or a place to put flowers, I would have chosen certainty. Today, I am not sure." The file's last page was typed by someone careful enough to repair a single comma before printing. Remains recovered at Derborence lakeside hut correspond to missing person Keller Andreas, born in 1947, Bern. Identification established by dental concordance, mtDNA, maternal line, and circumstantial artifact match, bracelet, book, scene. Cause of death, undetermined, environment and exposure suspected. Case closed at family request. Items loaned by consent for exhibit. Enamel mug, copy. Flora book, copy. Door fragment. The original mug returned to a small shelf in Sabine's kitchen where steam would again make a routine of the air. The door, sawn into 2 traveling pieces, went to the communal museum in Arden, where children learned that floods and rockfalls and avalanches have handwriting. A nail in the door pinched a sliver of leather under its head. The label did not say so. Labels are hygienic. The hut received a new beam, so the weather would not finish it before Story had time to make itself comfortable. A sign, no entry/site cultural, sat uneasily in 3 languages. Hikers still pressed their faces to the crack where the door had been. The hut, regaining its balance, tolerated them. Sometimes a wildflower lay on the sill, as if left by someone who wanted to apologize to the room for asking it to perform for strangers. The lake, true to itself, changed colors on a schedule that had nothing to do with morning. In the cafe, the old search grids from 1974 hung beside the new aerial photographs, orthomosaics with their sterile elegance. People put fingers on squares where men had walked in lines and failed to find a door a meter from their boots. "We always looked left to the lake when we should have looked right to the hut," a retired hiking club man said, not accusing anyone in particular, not forgiving himself. The innkeeper, polishing the same patch of counter by habit, said, "He rested, and the mountains held him," and then, as if the conversation were a stove, turned it down. There were, as always, more versions than bones. One late rumor suggested that Andreas had cracked his jaw the day he vanished, that the broken mandible proved a fight at the hut. The healed edges and rounded remodel said otherwise with the quiet authority of biology. Another version suggested that an animal had dragged him in, but the door had swollen shut, the timbers had fallen inward after his lying down, and the patterns of gnaw showed later visits by small teeth to exposed ends, not the violence of entry, but the etiquette of after. The forensic report, unromantic, allowed only the language of weather and metabolism. The police file learned to say undetermined with dignity, which is harder than it looks in print. Artifacts, the anchor pieces in any storm of versions, did their work. The bracelet, braided flat, twin to the one Sabine brought. The enamel mug, its ring permanent as a calendar's first circle. The Flora book with pencil notations that sometimes drifted into the shape of a poem. The photograph with its white border and its stamp declaring a month. The green wool fibers in the soil. The pollen that carried larch and gentian into the room years after the plants had shed them outside. Together they made of Andreas Keller not a case, but a man whose habits stayed long enough to greet the latecomers. Years do not stop trying to help. A month after the funeral, the Bice returned with its dry grammar and wrote whitecaps on the lake. A boy pressed his palm to the door's splinter and told his mother it felt warmer than the boulder. She said it was the sun. He shook his head with the authority of people who have not yet had to be wrong. Sabine, who had given up on birthdays but not on mornings, returned to the hut with a bracelet made that day. She set it on the bed frame at the place where a shoulder would choose to rest and whispered Jinnik into a room that knew what enough meant and what it did not. The record will say, for those who come later to the archives and for whom grief is paperwork, that Andreas Keller went to a hut in a storm and did not come back. that his friends waited at La Luzerne until the rain taught them arithmetic, that air glaciers flew a wall into a wall and reported negative until the word lost its edges, that a room kept a man the way a drawer keeps a letter, that decades moved their furniture, and that tourists in another summer opened a door and reset the balances of a valley. It will not say, because records do not, how the enamel mug smelled after the first tea Sabine poured into it at home, cardamom bruised with a spoon the way Andreas had done, nor how the bracelet warmed in her hand different from the way leather warms in anyone else's hand, nor how the Flora book, dried with blotting paper between its leaves, became again a thing that could be read without fear of erasing a man's last notation. At night, when wind pushes the lake into small angers and owls correct the record of mice, the hut returns to being a room that knows how to wait. Somewhere in Bern a photograph sits under glass on a shelf. In Schoen a folder sleeps among folders, its last page stamped archived, as if that word were gentler than done. In Arden a door fragment holds a nail that holds leather that held a wrist that held a pencil that underlined a plant whose Latin name nobody needs to know to understand what was meant. The valley continues to exchange weather with its peaks. The Diablerets keep their rumored noises. The cafe sells coffee stronger than anyone requires. A mystery remains, but it is the correct size, not the cliff-edge melodrama of crime, not the tidy comfort of cause assigned, but the ordinary astonishment that a man can step into a room while hail writes its small hard stories on a roof and simply not step out again. The mountains do not gloat. They keep their own counts. Sometimes, as here, they return a name. Often they do not. What is left then is the work the living owe the dead. To keep a mug upright, to learn the taste of a lake, to stop at a hut and say a name with the care of a person setting a cup down on a table that has survived more weather than anyone. Andreas Keller. Andreas Keller. The first two paragraphs of this story remembered to say him quickly. The last remembers to say him slowly, as if names, like lakes, taste different when you do not hurry. When the wind comes from the north and the hut's boards tense and relax like a chest that still remembers how, you can stand on the path where the tourists waited and hear the lake practice its vowels. You can think of a green parka and a bracelet that needed fixing and a note about gentians and the patient way rooms learn to keep and return. You can imagine, you are permitted, that the hut, if doors could speak without mockery, would tell you that it did not take him. It only sheltered what weather found. Under the larch, alpine rose will be late or early and will not care. The grid maps will continue to hang in the cafe, beside a new photograph of Sabine standing by the door with her hand lifted, as if hailing something kind. The story will end on a symbol because the valley asked for one, a shard of jaw the size of a man's last argument with luck. A bracelet on a bed frame, a mug cooled into its own ring, a photograph stamped with a month both far and present. The rest stays where huts prefer it. Inside, in the line between a rib and a book, under a roof that is patient with weather and names.